Hello, everyone. Welcome to the National Press Club, the virtual edition, the place where news happens. My name is Emily Wilkins. I'm secretary of the National Press Club, as well as a reporter for Bloomberg Government. I currently cover Congress and campaigns, but I previously covered education policy at the federal level. And I'm very, very excited today for a panel with a bunch of amazing panelists to be talking about an issue that I know is top of mind for everyone, but particularly I think for students and their parents. What is going on with coronavirus in schools? Where are we? Where do we need to go? What can we expect? And what changes will be brought about by this? This spring, 56 million students in kindergarten through high school, public and private, were sent home from school and told they couldn't come back. Nearly 20 million college and university students saw their campuses shutter, student life come to a halt. There were no classes, no graduation ceremonies, no proms, none of these events that so many students had worked and waited for. Attempts at distance learning have varied by school system and highlighted major inequalities, especially for low-income students. Remote learning is no substitute for classroom interaction, especially for younger children. For many students, schools aren't just for learning, they also provide meals and social services. And then there's the aspect of parents who are now having to juggle their full-time jobs as well as homeschooling their kids. Several new polls suggest that parents and teachers have major reservations about going back to school this fall. White House and CDC guidelines for reopening the country have yet to inspire a real confidence about when and how schools can welcome back their students and their teachers to their classrooms. On the higher education side, some prominent universities have in the past week committed to reopening in the fall, but college students have questioned whether they are going to get the full value of their tuition, considering less expensive options or even potentially taking gap years. Our panelists today are immersed in these critical decisions. The National Press Club is pleased to have them with us today and to help us understand how they are working to educate through the COVID-19 crisis. Our guests today include Superintendent Alberto Carvalho, the superintendent of the Miami-Dade County Public Schools. It is the fourth largest school system in the country. It's an extremely diverse one as well. He's been honored as Florida Superintendent of the Year and National Superintendent of the Year, among other awards. Miami-Dade has been cited as a leader in making remote education work. They've gotten laptops to students. They've gotten help getting low-income students quickly connected online. They were also quick to establish ways to get meals to students who need them. Another interesting thing is that they've conducted a survey asking every parent in the district their thoughts on going back to school in the fall. So I'm very excited to talking with the superintendent about that. Then we have Dr. Ann M. Kress, who became president of Northern Virginia Community Colleges in January, just before the coronavirus transformed campuses around the country. NOVA is the largest public education institution in Virginia and the second largest community college in the United States, with more than 75,000 students. It is also one of the most internationally diverse colleges in the United States, with a student body that comes from more than 180 countries. She's also served as president and other roles in community colleges in Florida and New York, and on the board of the American Association for Community Colleges. And then Dr. Kress Miller has a bird's eye view of school systems in every state. She is the executive director for the executive director of the Council of Chief State School Officers. I always got that acronym wrong, but as a reporter, I use them all the time. They're amazing. She's been working with top education officials in each state to develop a blueprint for reopening the fall. She served in leadership roles at CCSSO for 7 years, and before that, she herself was a deputy state superintendent in Idaho. Thank you everyone for joining us. Just a quick thing, if you are online and using Twitter, please use the hashtag NPC Live, that's NPC, National Press Club Live, hashtag if you want to follow along with the discussion. And to all of our panelists, thank you so much for taking time today to help us understand the challenges that your schools and school districts are facing, and for talking about what things might look like in the year to come.
Thank you.
If we can start off, I guess, with a question. I'll do a question for each of you guys, and then we'll do some general questions. We'll also open it up to various questions from those who are watching. I've got an eye on that, so I'll start asking those questions as they come in. But if we can start with Superintendent Carvalho, no school system seems to have specifically prepared for this crisis. It's very, very unprecedented. However, Miami-Dade has been cited in education circles as having jumped in, doing really well with delivering technology to students for online learning, and being more prepared to start online learning. I know I was reading a couple articles that show that Miami-Dade had started up before some other school districts with their online program. Can you share your insights on planning for this crisis and what lessons you've learned during this one?
Sure. Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity. Great conversation ahead. We didn't prepare for this crisis, but the reason why we were better prepared than others is because we had prepared for other crises. You know, we are a coastal city. We are a hurricane-prone area, and it is not unusual for our district to have to shut down and rely on a number of tools to provide a continuity of learning for students. And when we do shut down, we actually become, you know, the sheltering entity for the entire community. So our ability to manage the essentials for a community, food distribution, water distribution, even when shut down, we've perfected that over years. Our pandemic plan has been in existence for a number of years, and we adapted it to conditions specific to COVID-19 going back to January. And that's an important point I want to stress, is that we did not wait on the federal government or the state government to tell us that COVID-19 was coming. I remember placing this issue as an item of discussion back in January with my leadership team, and the discussion centered on consider a worst case scenario and what's our plan of action. And worst case scenario would be every single school shuts down in Miami-Dade, 520 schools. Our workforce stays home, students stay home. What is our plan for that? And the reason why we were somewhat more prepared than I believe most districts across the country is because we had made the right investments, not in preparation for a crisis, but quite frankly, as a result of our insight into the evolution of learning, our dependency on technology, and passing a $1.2 billion bond referendum back in 2012 that created virtually ubiquitous universal Wi-Fi for students, close to one solution. From January, February, beginning of March, we developed agreements with our teachers union to ensure there was fair accountability and appropriate training for teachers for this transition from traditional teaching to distance learning. We surveyed our parents. That was the very first parent survey during the crisis to determine their technological needs and determine exactly the number of parents that would need a device, a hotspot, or both, and began to put these gears in motion. That is why when we shut off our school system in a traditional way, we reopened it with distance learning based on an instructional continuity plan that was well known, professional development for teachers, and community awareness as to what would take place with every single student having a device. So for us to put 120,000 devices in the hands of students and 11,000 hotspots with personalized adaptive content, even for students with disabilities or English language learners, was quite frankly a continuity of our investment over years into different ways of teaching that rely on parental choice, adaptive technology, differentiated instruction, which was already present in the classroom.
Got it. So a lot of preparing, a lot of being able to move quickly and utilize things quickly. Dr. Mofa Miller, you know, that's one school district. You obviously are working with chief education leaders in every state, every school district. We know that the coronavirus has severely impacted some states and some areas, while others have not fared quite as poorly. But I wanted to see from your perspective, looking at the varying impact of the coronavirus and the ways that states have responded, can you give any sort of overview about what has worked best at this point and any lessons that you think that school districts need to be taking away from the last 10 weeks and getting ready to apply going forward into the fall?
Well, thank you, Emily, and thanks for inviting me to be here this morning. I think I'll start with we created a framework, which was, at 4 to 5 weeks of listening to our state superintendents and all of the things that they were dealing with. And so we had entered in, much like Alberto described in Miami, this phase one which was the immediate on-the-ground response in most of the states. And those kinds of things were the getting meals to kids. A lot of places were not as prepared as what he just described, and ensuring that students had access to Wi-Fi and also having devices. And so there was a lot of work to try and make that happen, and it's still very disparate. There's a lot of efforts that have gone into making sure that kids have access. And then from there, it was working on the continuity of learning. So we moved into a phase 2 plan, which was, talking about 4 areas that chiefs felt like they needed to focus on. The first was the continuity of learning, which I'll describe a little bit of that detail. The other part was the conditions for learning. And this is the part where we get into the social and emotional needs of kids. And as we go into this further, as we think about what the fall looks like, all of the needs of students and their social emotional needs can't be forgotten. And that's a lot of what state superintendents are speaking about. We also talked about the policy and funding, because at the state level, all the things that Alberto described can either get in the way or they can enable. And so there was a lot of discussion about what were some of the things that needed to be set aside, some of the ways in which we thought about seat time, for example, really go out the window when you're talking about delivering education virtually and being more flexible about that. And so those were some of the things we were looking at. On the continuity of learning, I just want to put a plug in for a few things. There was like how we do virtual summer school. This was something that we had just put out with our state superintendents, but there's much more that needs to be thought about. And there were continuity of learning plans coming out from states quickly, having to be put together. So I'll stop there. I think we'll have an opportunity to talk more about that, but just continuity of learning, the conditions for learning, leadership by our states, and the policy and planning were the key things that they had to think about how they enabled the best conditions for students.
Definitely. And I know we're definitely going to be getting to some of that stuff a little bit later in this webinar, but I did want to go to Dr. Kress. You're not only leading the largest community college in Virginia, but you've been asked by the governor to lead a task force of community colleges across the state. I do want to take a moment and recognize that when we do think about community college students, it's an incredibly diverse group. We're not just talking about the high school seniors who, the next year went to community college. We're talking about older adults juggling work, people making career transitions. We really have sort of people from all walks of life in community colleges at this point. Can you share how you have responded to the crisis, and what are the big takeaways from your conversations with other community college presidents about moving forward during coronavirus?
Sure, and thank you. I think this is an incredibly important discussion. A few things I would say. So Northern Virginia Community College, we're in a very good area when we start talking about remote learning, because access to the internet is really ubiquitous within our region. That can't be said for much of Virginia, however. So for NOVA, we've been delivering online and distance education for more than 40 years, beginning all the way back when distance education was correspondence school. So when the flip to remote learning came for us, we were able to do it pretty seamlessly and very quickly. But when you start to look across the state, when you start to look across the great diversity of institutions that make up the community college sector, you see large urban institutions like ours, like Miami-Dade, in Superintendent Carvalho's district. And then you see some very small rural institutions, Mountain Empire, for example, Patrick Henry in Virginia, where access to the internet is in some cases unheard of. In some cases is still dial-up modem access. So we really start to hit some equity issues when you look at the diversity of our institutions. It's also true about the diversity of our students. So NOVA is a very diverse institution. We have no majority student population. So we really saw, for example, a lot of the things that we've been talking about is that the pandemic has hit us all, but it hasn't hit us all equally. So for NOVA students, when you're talking about a student population where 2/3 go part-time, that those 2/3 were likely employed in sectors where unemployment is really among the highest, whether it's retail or hospitality or personal services, then you start to hit into some economic challenges. And so NOVA did a number of things. We started before the government gave out emergency aid. Our foundation came forward and immediately started an emergency aid fund so that students could get quick response grants of up to $500 to just pay for the cost of living until they could begin to collect unemployment. We also turned our parking lots into Wi-Fi hotspots. We distributed laptops to students who raised their hands and said that they didn't have access to laptops. So we really started to close some of those initial gaps, but we, again, had the resources to do that. What we know is that many of our sister institutions do not, and I think that's, we'll eventually get into this, but I think that's really when we start to look at what the federal government can do, what states can do to better support our institutions in serving our students. I think it was Thomas Bailey, when he was president of the Community College Resource Center, who said that community colleges have the least amount of resources to serve the students who have the greatest amount of need. And we have certainly seen that come to the fore during the pandemic.
Absolutely. And yes, we're going to get into finances in just a minute, but there is one question I wanted to put to all of you guys. And I think this is sort of the big overarching question when you think about schools and coronavirus, which is, when are things going to reopen? And what is that going to look like? Are you going to see students who, have to get a temperature check before they walk into every classroom? How are you going to keep teachers safe? How are you going to keep the students safe? And I just wanted to see if you could obviously we're going to get into many, many more details throughout this webinar, but I wanted to see if you could give a brief overview of when and how you see your schools reopening.
So we are about to close the 1920 school year within 2 weeks. And we will reopen schooling immediately thereafter. So I think one of the natural consequences of COVID-19 is that this idea of year-round schooling probably is going to become more a reality than anything else, particularly for groups of students who always faced achievement gaps. And one of my biggest concerns is exactly that, is that we have a very poor student population, over 50,000 English language learners in our school system alone. 11% of our student body has one or more disabilities. And those are the students who probably lost the most ground as a result of this disrupted fourth quarter, which will be followed by the summer, during which time American students experience some degree of academic regression, but the most fragile students experience the greatest level of academic regression. Mm-hmm. So for us, schooling will resume within days after the regular school year ends. And we're doing that through 2 virtual summer sessions with lower teacher to student ratios, particularly targeting the fragile populations, those students who need credit recovery, those students who, on the basis of formative assessment, we know will struggle next school year, those students who, even though the state this year canceled state assessments, so they're going to be promoted. They are on track to graduate, but there will be an academic shock next year unless we intervene right now. So those 2 summer sessions will serve that purpose. We plan then to bring students back, and how we bring them back is still depending on the evolution of COVID-19 over the summer. 2 weeks before the regular school year begins, that's for 25% of our student population, that's 46,000 students. We're going to reopen our school system for that targeted population that we have identified already. We're assigning virtual mentors and tutors to every one of these students. We're going to add 1 additional hour of instruction to up to 30 schools in the district that reflect the highest concentration of these students. But specific to your question, yes, we will do temperature checks at the school bus stop. for students entering schools. We transport a huge number of kids. We have the largest school bus system in the world, so that for us is a concern. Yes, we will have unidirectional hallways to reduce contact. Yes, meals will be Uber style to the classroom rather than in cafeterias. Gyms, large areas will have to be converted, so it'll be a space redesign to increase social distancing. But that's the easy thing to do. The harder thing is to navigate teacher, staff, student ratios at a time of fiscal shock. The harder thing to do will be the appropriate match of parental desire, student need to the professional on a basis of a parent's choice. You know, you talked at the beginning about a survey. We know right off the bat at this point that close to 40% of our parents want kids to go back to a traditional environment. But about 1/3 of our parents have grave concerns about having their kids return to school. So we are not envisioning a one-size-fits-all approach to next school year. We are contemplating a number of scenarios, and I'm absolutely certain that we will have to deploy a number of different modalities of teaching and learning to adapt and meet parents and students where they are, depending on their choices. So we will have schooling in August. I suspect that a percentage of our students will be in school. A percentage of our students will be in remote learning based on parental choice. And then there will be a percentage of our students who will embrace a blended hybrid model that can incorporate both. And I'll just leave you with this possibility, which I think is almost unavoidable. At a time of fiscal scarcity, when you have to reduce class size for the purpose of social distancing, you may not necessarily have the resources to go out and hire every single teacher you would need to have no more than 10 students in a classroom. So technology, logistics need to come into play. So it is possible that one of the hybrid models will be a blended version where in a class of 20 students, 10 students are physically present with the teacher one day. The other 10 students are zooming in on the Promethean board, which we have installed with surround sound in every single classroom in Miami-Dade. The following day, it alternates. The students who are present are now home, and the ones who are home are now in school, connecting using the same platform. So it will be a multitude of platforms, of ways of teaching kids. It cannot be, will not be a one-size-fits-all, because conditions will not allow it. The fiscal reality will not allow it. And probably the health conditions and safety conditions by then, hard to predict what they will be, but may not be suitable for us to contemplate everybody returning at the same time.
Emily, I'll weigh in on this one. I think it's a loaded question now when it never had been. When will we be back at school? I think it's redefining, first of all, what school is, going back to school. And I think the way Alberto described this is what we're seeing play out in some of the early places that have opened. So some of the states out in the West who hadn't had as many cases opened a little earlier, and we're bringing back smaller groups of students to finish out the school year. But we are, really at the end of the school year. So what we're seeing is people planning for restart, some of them as early as July. And that is even outside of summer school options, which if they're doing virtual or the blended options that Alberto mentioned, we're seeing some schools talking about starting in July. And it will have to be a different framing of when we go back to school, because I think it will not be exactly the way that we were before that until we can get to a place where the risk mitigation is situated that people feel comfortable. All the things that Alberto described are things that our state leaders are dealing with. And so they're having to think about how do they deliver education. But I think we'll see phases of this as we've seen now. We learn more and more each month, and what we plan for in July may be different than what we have to plan for in August. and then we adjust in September and we keep moving forward. And so it's about being malleable and thinking about all those things. Do we continue to do, for example, temperature checks in perpetuity? Is there masks? How much social distancing? How many people in the classroom? And all those things, get updated. And so we have to adjust and think about the local context. I think from my vantage point, looking at the various places that have dealt with this, it's really about being very clear and being very connected to the state health officials who are very important in this discussion. The connection between, in our world, the connection between the chief, the state health official, and the governor, and then obviously superintendent is critical. It's a community effort. It can't just be the school that puts forward social distancing measures and works on that if the community is not a part of that. It just won't be useful.
And I'll just pick up on a couple of the themes that have already been mentioned. One of them, I think, is the level of uncertainty that we're all dealing with right now, that we put in place plans one week that we realize by the end of that week just don't really hold water anymore. And so that's one of the things we're looking at NOVA for fall. So we've made a public commitment that we will advise our students and our faculty and our staff by June 8th what we think fall is going to look like. We have engaged our faculty through our College Senate. We've reached out to students. We've heard from students. They've reached out to us. And what we're hearing is really, I think, what we've already heard in this conversation, which is that it's got to be a combination of all of the above, that there's going to be some remote instruction, likely for courses that don't really need that hands-on interaction, but very different perhaps for a community college and for a university is that there are a number of the courses that we offer that really cannot move forward if they cannot move forward face-to-face. So during the flip to remote in spring, we got some special dispensation, for example, from various accreditors, whether it was something like our health programs and nursing or other programs, such as automotive technology that allowed us to use simulations or to have lecture substitute for some of the hands-on experience, but those passes have ended. And so we really need to think about how we can bring students back to help them progress in their career pathways, especially. And I think the important thing for all of us to understand, as well as, from a community college perspective, from the community perspective, that these are career pathways that will help folks who are currently unemployed find better economic futures for themselves and for their families. So that is something that's really weighing with us when we think about fall semester, is how can we help the students who we know really need to come back to continue in their courses of study, to be back on our campuses, while also maintaining the level of social distance and following the good guidance from the CDC, and in our case, the Virginia Department of Health and Governor Northam's office in what we can expect. And I think I also just want to underscore that we do not exist in a vacuum, right? Especially as community colleges, our students go out into the community, they come back to our institutions. We are part of our community. We partner with business and industry. We partner with local elected leaders. We partner with our school districts. So we see this really as an entire ecosystem of decision-making that needs to occur. And it doesn't occur outside of public health guidance. It doesn't occur outside of any of those statements. For example, this week, Governor Northam signed an executive order requiring face masks. So, we have that going into the school year. That may continue all the way through August and September. And then really quickly, the last thing I want to hit on is something that the superintendent talked about, which is that the incredible disruptive nature that this year in particular has had for seniors. And we are very concerned that we'll have a group of seniors for whom this might have been a lost academic year and who may be thinking about their future in terms of college education. I'll be very honest, students who typically come to community college from high school don't take gap years. So if they don't come to college directly from high school, the likelihood that they will return to college is very slim. But we know that their best economic future is going to be through continuing higher education. So we have been partnering with our school districts on trying to make the best use of summer through providing scholarships for concurrent enrollment so students can pick up college level coursework during their summer, which would otherwise be wasted, to help them keep that momentum going, because that's going to be critical for all of us.
So all of you have mentioned good ideas for sort of how to potentially help students continue on track, whether that's expanding the school day, upping summer programs and outreach to students through that. But I know that all of these things, or at least most of them, do come with a price tag. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that because Dr. Kress, as you just mentioned, there are students who might be saying, well, you know what, I'm not going to go to community college after all. There are international students who might decide that if they can't have that in-person classroom experience, they simply don't want it. State and local revenues are looking very, very different now from last year. And so I wanted to see if you guys could talk a little bit about the financial aspect here. What are school budgets going to look like? Is there, I mean, how do you guys continue to provide an education with the increased measures while staying within your budgets? What needs to be done both at the school level as well as the local, state, and federal level?
So go ahead. So I'll jump out. We also have made a decision across the Virginia Community College system to keep our tuition flat year on year. So going into next year, students won't pay any more for what they receive from Virginia's community colleges, including Nova. And in fact, going into next year, Nova's reduced one of our fees as well. So, we are trying to be as fiscally responsible with an eye toward the costs of higher education to students and to families. But the reality is, we are intentionally trying to repurpose a lot of our assets. So just to give you a couple examples and then to talk about the importance of investment. So one thing is that when we moved to remote, we recognized that we really needed folks who could reach out to our students. So we internally inside of Nova recruited a group that we called the Remote Student Support Specialists, RS3s, who reached out on a regular basis to our remote students to make sure that they felt connected to the institution, right? You have 75,000 students, 73,000 students. You want to make sure that they understand where they are, how they should be moving forward. But we did that without any additional resources. I will say there is a limit to what we can do with what we have. And that is when investment comes into play. The road to recovery runs through the institutions that you see reflected in this panel, right? Through K-12, through community colleges, through higher education. But we also know that when budget times are difficult, our institutions are often among the first to see cuts. And that's unfortunate because this is really an investment in the future. And to tell you what an investment can do, the Jumpstart program I mentioned, we're serving 3,400 high school seniors this summer with scholarship concurrent enrollment online that'll allow them to pick up 6 credit hours of college education for free. And we're using our institutional stimulus dollars that were provided by the federal government to do that. That's a small investment for an incredible payoff for students who first, were able to recover a disrupted senior year. Second, move on and achieve 6 free college credits that are transferable. 5 of those courses are college transfer courses. One of them is an intro course that we're offering in partnership with Amazon Web Services and cloud computing. So it's the start of a career pathway. That investment of about $4 million from the federal government will have invaluable payoff. But I think too often the short-sightedness around investment is that, well, let's cut what's easy to cut, and then we'll be able to balance our budgets. And unfortunately, you start to eat your seed corn. So I do think the investment that we'll see coming from the federal government incentivizing states to maintain effort in terms of their investment in K-12 and in higher education is going to be ever more important, because the families that we serve are often those who are the most at risk in our communities, who have the ability to add to our tax base, to rebuild our economy, but not if we're not invested in.
For me, this is like the perfect storm, right? You have a health crisis that leads to potentially, more than likely, an academic crisis wrapped within a fiscal crisis, the likes of which this nation has never seen. So it could be catastrophic or not. It depends on the level of federal commitment to states and local educational institutions unfolds between now and the beginning of the next academic year. As a matter of comparison, during the last great recession of 2008, 2009, I was superintendent. I remember having to slash our massive budget by over $2 billion in a very short period of time. During that time, about $115 billion were earmarked nationally to stabilize and to rescue K-12 systems across the country. At this point, so far, only 16 billion have been appropriated. So we're very hopeful that there will be another stimulus package, this time specifically directed at local governments, inclusive of school districts, as they are usually the largest employers in any one municipal area across the country. So if you are trying to stabilize employment, you don't do that by forcing a huge employment sector in all of our communities to the street. But I think we need two additional things. So this is both a quantitative as well as a qualitative conversation. Quantitative, yes, we need additional federal resources. What Anne has said is absolutely right. With the appropriate federal safeguards that do not allow for the supplanting of state and local appropriations. This ought to be really an add-on to stabilize educational opportunity in school systems. But secondly, we have an opportunity as these funds are appropriated to fundamentally change some regulations, both at the federal level and state level, that basically mandate seat time as a prerequisite for funding. FCC regulations that have really not allowed districts to move as swiftly as they could have in terms of modernizing their inventory of technology for the benefit of kids. E-rate regulations. All of that needs to be looked at if we are to emerge on the other side better than where we find ourselves today. But yes, without federal assistance, we're looking at a catastrophic condition in Miami-Dade, across the country. And my biggest concern is that some kids and some families will not necessarily feel it, but those kids across America who were in crisis prior to this crisis will stand to lose the most. And in high poverty districts with strong percentages of English language learners, those are the districts that will be hit the hardest if there isn't the necessary federal investment with short-term, with a longer-term change to policies that actually hinder the nimbleness that districts need to have today to meet students where they are.
Yeah, Emily, I'll move us up to like a 50,000 foot level. When I think back to the CARES Act, which really wasn't that long ago, but can often feel like years that we've been dealing with this. I just think about the CARES Act and how important that supplemental was. But at the same time, I think it's important for us to keep in mind that that was really to cover the extraordinary expenses that, at least on the K-12 side, were being incurred at the district level, the amount of cleaning, the meals that need to be provided. So that it wasn't this, it wasn't an infusion into the budget. It was taking care of the most immediate needs for schools and for states. And so we absolutely feel like the HEROES Act that came out of the House, and we'll look to the Senate to come with a supplemental that will help create an infusion for all these things that we talked about. Let me just name a few of, we've talked about the staffing patterns, the buses, the amount of cleaning that will need to be done. I mean, it's just fundamental, like buying cleaning supplies. If we have to have masks at the schools so that there's abilities for that. If you needed to have portables brought in so you actually could do more social distancing, those things are all a cost. In addition, really encouraged to see in the HEROES Act specifically the call out for the broadband and connectivity as a huge investment in that. And so, the two systems that we're talking to today have good access, but largely there's really important places in the country that just don't. And so that kind of investment is really important. But writ large, the kind of investment that's needed, both because we're seeing state budgets anywhere being cut from 20% and even into the 30%. The discussions right now are on the table, and that will be catastrophic. And so we're looking to a supplemental that not just covers the expenses, but helps create some of that infusion as well.
We have a couple of questions from a few of our viewers. I wanted to go to one that was a little bit along these lines from Mitchell Morovitz. Apologies if I mispronounce, with the University of Maryland Global Campus. He has a question specifically for Dr. Cavallo, although I would say if anyone has any ideas on this, feel free to chime in. He mentions that in his experience, it's very difficult to get managers to agree to spend difficult to get funds on emergencies that might come up. So sort of being able to put this funding away for things that might occur, but not necessarily. And he wanted to see Superintendent Cavallo, if you could comment a little bit on how Miami-Dade's history with natural disasters helped your arguments to get the funds that you had, that you were able to utilize quickly when the coronavirus disaster began.
Yeah, thank you. Good question. I remember during the last recession, there were opportunities. Never failed to recognize a potential opportunity, within any one crisis. And I remember, for example, recognizing that few districts across the country back in 2009 had the necessary match to draw down E-rate funds. We didn't either, but we actually engaged in a community effort to help us raise $7 million to draw down $70 million of federal investment. That was the seed that actually started our digital convergence back in 2009. We began the shift of our school system from a system where only 30% of the students were taking advantage of public school choice to where we are today, where 74% of our kids are enrolled in untraditional programs, a system that had invested very little in technology, certainly on one-to-one solutions, driven by applications to one where today, every one of our students is connected with a device, hotspot, universal, ubiquitous access to the internet. And we did that not because these were luxuries. We deemed it essential back then through a lens of equity. If we did not fix the digital divide, then teaching and learning for some kids would be limited to bell time in school. And that for us was just not an acceptable position. Yes, we as a system have been helped by our history of shutting down schools, having to feed students and their families, recognizing the food insecurity that a lot of our kids face and their families face. We have had to develop plans for that. Those plans have helped us now during this crisis. So yes, when we shut down our system, we continue to distribute food. Over 3.4 million meals out of schools, in addition to over 40,000 hot meals distributed directly to the community via our foundation that actually hires restaurants to cook food. We're simultaneously putting people in restaurants to work as we're bringing food to communities in need. But let me talk about the structure, and I'll single out 3 specific areas. I talked about systemic change to the way funds are appropriated and regulations that condition technology investments by community colleges, by state universities, as well as public school systems. Those need to change, and there are some solutions in the making. USDA regulations. Why did it take a special bill to actually recognize that in times of crisis, parents and families may not necessarily come to school or the school where the kid attends to pick up a free meal? That needs to be simplified. New regulations need to be brought up to speed to recognize current conditions. So work needs to be done at that level. And then lastly, as I said earlier, crisis or no crisis, I think just the evolution of the power of parents to choose how, when, where, and by whom they are taught should make everybody think about how we continue to fund education. And if we do not take bold action across the country between now and August, we will lose many kids, we will lose many parents, particularly to the promise of public education. Some will continue to get it because they always got it. And that's the demand side of parent. The supply side of parent will not. And that will be one gap that will continue to open. So I'm asking aggressively, shouting out across the country, let's change the way we fund education. Let's liberalize the way we feed kids, the provisions. Let's make access to technology more flexible on the way by way of lifting some of the regulatory hurdles that currently exist. Yes, prior challenges that we face as a district, hurricane shutdowns, have prepared us to deal with this storm better than other districts, but a new normal is now being created, and we're not going to go back to the way we used to be. And the genie is not going to go back in a bottle. And one of the things I know is that parents are making decisions as we speak. And come August, they will make additional decisions. And we ought to be prepared for that. And the only way to prepare is to liberalize, to be more flexible, remove some of the regulatory hurdles for us to meet parents and students where they are.
I actually wanted to jump in here because I know that talking about sort of the status quo of learning in a school with a blackboard and a teacher in the front of the room versus other options for schooling, personalized learning, online learning, remote learning. That was always something that was debated pretty hotly when I was covering education. And it seems to me now that coronavirus has really sort of given this opportunity to sort of force these changes upon some systems and see how they're working. Dr. Kress, I know additionally with colleges, there was a lot of discussion about online learning, the benefits of that, how is it compared to in-classroom learning? And so I wanted to sort of just open it up to all the panelists here to talk a little bit about what kind of changes might come to actual learning itself? I mean, just beyond the whole testing and social distancing in classrooms, how might we actually see how kids are taught, 5, 10 years from now? How might that be impacted by what we're seeing now with the coronavirus and how schools and districts are having to adapt?
Mm-hmm. Well, so let me jump out there because I'll say something that might be a little controversial, but I think that the learning part, right, the distance education part is in many ways the easiest part of this equation to figure out. The delivery of instruction is the delivery of all of the other services that students expect from an academic institution, whether it's counseling or advising, whether it's meals, as we've heard before. I will just speak to Nova. In January, we got the results back from study that we did with the Hope Center at Temple University of student basic needs. And 50% of NOVA students presented one or more basic needs. So they were food insecure, they were housing insecure, 15% of them were homeless, right? So they come to our institutions for lots of different reasons. How do we supply library services? How do we supply just that interaction that students would have had with each other, those leadership skills that are developed in our organizations? I think some of the times when you hear students question, should I pay my full tuition for going remote? What they're really saying is, this environment does not deliver everything that I thought college was going to be, everything that college was going to help me become. And so I do think the next revolution, if you will, in education is going to be, how do we take everything else that happens on a college campus and work to provide it in a virtual environment? NOVA, for example, started a virtual student union. Within short order, we had close to 5,000 students participating in everything from job skills, interviews, to dance-alongs, to student organizations and clubs. It may seem a little frivolous, but that's really part of what college experience is. It's that socialization, it's growing. So I do think when you talk about the evolution and the revolution that's happening in education, what we really need to think about is not only the classroom instruction, but what goes on beyond that, that really helps shape our students into leaders and helps them grow.
And Superintendent Cavallo, I know that you also mentioned, you've mentioned a number of things. You've mentioned regulations, you've mentioned seat time, you've mentioned choice. And I wanted to see how perhaps you see public schools adapting pieces of that, going into, I guess, for not only the rest of the coronavirus pandemic, but beyond. What lessons have you learned?
I want to pick up where Ann left off. I wholeheartedly agree. I think the easier thing is for us to provide continuity of learning. So the pedagogical process, whether it is in the classroom or at home, will continue. Less than ideal, it is disruptive, particularly for the younger child and for the fragile student. And those are the ones I'm most concerned with. It's the social emotional support. It's the elements that schooling does in terms of filling the opportunity gaps that kids experience from birth that aren't easily addressed or delivered via distance learning. With that said, specific to your question, I said earlier, the genie is not going to go back in the bottle. Parents for the past 2 months have had a front row seat where they have been observing, witnessing what education is really like. 2 things they've discovered. Number one, it is tough work. It is not easy, the life of a teacher. Secondly, I think they recognize that the best place for a child to learn is in fact in school. For all the reasons we know, the necessary socialization, the interaction, the personalized attention that a caring, well-trained, dedicated adult can provide to a child. But as we've learned, parents are making choices. And I think that inevitably, what's taken place over the past 2 months has catapulted the nation forward, where without the crisis probably would take 10 to 15, 20 years to do. But a crisis was sort of the tectonic shift in the evolution of education in this country. And I do believe your question, 5, 10 years from now, number one, who knows? But my suspicion is that 5 years from now, education will be much more along the lines of meeting kids and parents exactly where they are, much more personalized, much more adaptive. Will rely not at all on seat time requirements. It will be education and schooling despite the school itself, but I hope always influenced by the presence of a teacher who understands not only the cognitive development of children, but also the societal needs, the opportunity gaps that kids face. So it will rely less 5, 10 years from now on a physical space, the where. It will rely more on the how, when, and by whom. And that's sort of the flexibility that this crisis has demanded of us. You know, we had to stretch ourselves to be able to deliver everything we used to deliver in different ways. With that said, we don't have an answer, and I think Anne addressed this. You know, for the kindergarten child, the severely disabled child who requires a one-to-one paraprofessional, that is virtually impossible to be delivered at home without some degree of professional to child access. So yes, the wraparound is much more difficult than the simple delivery of content online, whether it is a teacher on Zoom or adaptive software that is application platform driven. So those are the issues I think we need to spend time decoding. Otherwise, those, as I said earlier, who've always been in crisis, their crisis is actually going to get deeper and the abyss much darker. And that's what we as a nation need to confront right now.
Is there anything right now that you're doing specifically for students with disabilities or have individualized learning plans to help them during this time?
Yes. So number one, the IEP continues to drive the educational program for that child. And even though the paraprofessional may not necessarily be physically present, to the extent that the online resources aren't sufficient for that child, then there are packets of supplemental materials for that child. There is a virtual parent academy to support parents who are right now assisting their children navigating their own schooling at home, which is different than homeschooling. So for the child with disabilities, the IEP continues to drive their educational process, but I'm telling you, it is not ideal. It's falling short here in Miami-Dade and across the country because our systems in our nation, we were not ready to deliver all of the essential support for children in crisis, children with disabilities, without or outside the school environment. We're not ready for that, particularly in the middle of a health crisis that requires distancing, which is the exact opposite of what some of our kids actually need. They need social interaction, they need direct support, sometimes physical support, depending on their disability. So that is where that is the reason why I'm losing sleep right now, is just within weeks, how do we fix that? Or how do we improve upon that, specifically for the student with disability, specifically for the English language learner, but also for high achieving kids, where this crisis should not be a limited ceiling to their opportunity. And that's exactly what we're tackling.
And if I could just jump in really quickly as a follow-up, I think what the superintendent's comments have underscored and what I think we've experienced at NOVA is that this entire pandemic, the shift to remote, has revealed, I think, the essential foundational aspects of being in a place, that social emotional support, that connection that we have yet to replicate in this sort of environment. And I'm just reflecting, we had 3 students who won a Jack Kent Cook Scholarship. They're community college students from very difficult backgrounds who now are going on to selective 4-year institutions, fully scholarshiped. And to a person, each one of those students talked about the connection they made with faculty, the connection they made with individuals at the college. They were very high achieving, but somebody needed to see that in them and needed to nurture it. And I think that's one of the things we're starting to realize, that it is more difficult to do in this environment. So it is not students alone who have IEPs or in an academic environment need accommodations at the higher ed level, but it is really students across the continuum for whom their preference would be to be in a classroom with others, to connect directly with a faculty member, an advisor, somebody in an office who can see something in them and move them forward. That is something that's ineffable, that we have yet to distill in a way that we can deliver it remotely.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna piggyback off of that. All of the social emotional and things that we just can't replicate in a virtual Zoom environment for kids. I absolutely agree with my colleagues on that. I do want to take a different take on the continuity of learning, because we have 2 very high functioning system leaders on the call right now. And there is an opportunity for high quality instructional materials to be developed at scale, for economies of scale for places that don't have that. And so while the continuity of learning in Miami-Dade, they've got it figured out, there are a lot of places that could really benefit from this grouping of high quality instructional materials. And we're working on putting some things out for states to be able to utilize in June. So I do want to just say that the academic piece, I don't think is locked and loaded for everybody. And I do think there is an opportunity to assist teachers, particularly when they're at home with their own kids, having a way in which to do the instruction in a streamlined way and making it easier so that the instruction is what they're providing and instead of having to pull some things together. So I do just want to add that piece.
Absolutely, and that's incredibly important context. And you kind of touched we've got less than 20 minutes. And we haven't touched on a very important topic that Dr. Miller just mentioned, which is teachers themselves. How to make sure that they are staying safe, that they are staying healthy. I mean, as you mentioned, for teachers who have kids of their own at home. I want to see sort of how you guys are thinking at this point about teacher safety. If you're working particularly as Superintendent Carvello with any teachers union, sort of what things you're hearing from them. I mean, how might this work if you have a teacher who's older or has an immune disease and would love to go back and teach their class, but they're at much higher risk? How do you handle them when the school year, when you decide it is possible to have more students coming back into a physical school building?
Yes, thank you for asking that, because I think often during this time of this pandemic crisis, we focus a lot of our attention, as we should, on the recipient of the educational opportunity, the student, the direct entity who is so close to the student, while at home, the parent. And sometimes we don't pay enough attention to the needs of teachers, the social and emotional needs of teachers. I can tell you that as we were gearing up to close schools and activate distance learning, we established hotlines of support for parents, for students, and for teachers. And we got a lot of calls from teachers. We did not need technical assistance, even though we had a hotline for technical assistance, but needed emotional support during this transition. Teachers are missing their kids. A lot of our teachers are missing the environment they felt was nurturing to their own profession. Outside of it, it is not the same. And many of them are dealing with two types of pressures. They are being very often not only the teacher, a role model, a surrogate father, mother to a kid in need or kids in need in neighborhoods where the kids are, and the teacher knows what those kids are going through. At the same time that this teacher is supporting their own children at home with their continuity of learning. They're being teachers twice, parents twice. And as we contemplate all of the ways by which we will reactivate the school system, we cannot forget them. And this needs to be considered. And we spoke about this before this program began. Needs to be contemplated in the way teachers are trained, because I think we've learned that there's a new skill set that needs to be addressed as part of teacher preparation formation, whether it is navigating the technology necessary to teach kids from a distance, how to navigate the social and emotional support from a distance, the necessary tools that must be available for dealing with students with disabilities from a distance. That's a new skill set that I think we need to prepare teachers for. Secondly, to your question, yes, before we shut down the school system, we had conversations with our union. We have a very collaborative, cooperative relationship with organized labor in Miami-Dade. And we developed protocols for distance learning that included accountability measures for teachers as well as students. And we are doing so for the reopening, whatever that is and whenever that is. It is negotiated, it is understood, we identify, mutually agree on where the needs are, and we address them. One of the critical concerns is there are individuals whose circumstances may not allow them to come back to a typical work environment because of their own health fragility, their age, or the dependency that a member of their family may have on them. That is why when I talk about the fact that this cannot be a one-size-fits-all, I'm referring not only to students, but actually to our workforce. It cannot, it will not. Number one, there will not be enough money to support based on the demands of social distancing and precautions. There will not be enough money to have the old system back in a fully functional way. So yes, we are developing protocols. We're in conversations. We talked about a parent survey. We're doing a teacher survey, incorporating what we learned from the parents to clearly understand the needs of our teachers and how we can engage in an adequate match of student need to teacher need. I suspect that one of the things we will learn is as we reactivate the school system this coming year, is that you may have enough students who opt into a blended learning model that perfectly adapts to the needs of the teaching workforce that for a whole host of reasons may not be able to come back because of age, because of the fragility of their own health, may actually be a good match. We are assessing that right now as we prepare to open for 2021.
Emily, I'd just add that's a really important cost, because the training and the flexibility for teachers is one of those costs that we talked about earlier when there's in terms of the need. I would just say from a state level, as state leaders are thinking about this, it's first and foremost about health and safety of teachers and kids, period. And then it is about how do we address the continuity of learning. And so providing with high quality instructional materials, providing guidance on that, and then also providing training, which training is a cost and is something we need to invest in. And that's about teaching in a new way. So those are just and being flexible with teachers.
I think a lot of what we're thinking about at NOVA very much aligns with what the superintendent mentioned. Certainly, we're guided by Virginia Department of Human Resources, Management, accommodations, all of that. I think, in many respects, that's the easiest part to manage. But we also need to recall that there has been online learning in higher ed for a very long time. There has been distance education in higher ed for a very long time. But the vast majority of professors don't elect that. And they really value that connection in the classroom. That's where they see that they do their best work. So I think this, again, goes to that notion of emotional and social support that the superintendent mentioned, that there is a real disconnect for some of our staff at this moment, faculty and staff alike, advisors, counselors, librarians who are used to seeing students. That's really what drew them to this work. I have to say, if you're in a community college, you didn't come into higher education to be a researcher. You came in to be a teacher, and you're a teacher regardless of whether you're in the classroom or an advisement office. And that is a connection that I think a lot of our faculty and staff are missing right now. And so we will have individuals who, for lots of different reasons, do not believe that they can come back to the classroom. But we also have many individuals who desperately want to come back to the classroom. And it is incumbent upon all of us to think about their health and well-being as we figure out a way of phasing them back in, so that they can serve the students that really drew them to this work to begin with.
Absolutely. And I did want to reference quickly, there was at least one national poll, I think it was by USA Today, that suggested that teachers aren't yet sure about returning to the classroom. And I wanted to see if that matched up with what you guys are hearing from teachers and professors as schools begin to think about if and how to reopen.
Yeah, the USA Today poll, which was, I believe, released 2 days ago, revealed that up to 20% of the teaching workforce has great doubts about returning to school, to the classroom, and may actually be an indicator of those who may be willing to leave the profession because of that. I don't think that will be reflected in Miami-Dade. Personally, I do not, for a number of reasons. Number one, this community has demonstrated support for teachers. I mentioned 2 referenda that this board courageously put before the voters. The first one was for technology and school renovation and construction. But in 2018, November of 2018, we passed a historic referendum for the purpose of teacher salaries. Our teachers were earning below the national average in terms of salaries. And as a result of that referendum, teachers received anywhere between 14 and 23% increase in their salaries, catapulting them from below national average to above national average. Secondly, in a very tight job market, sadly, there aren't many options. And there is still a degree of protection when your job is secured by local taxation in addition to state investment. And I think if we continue to have a dialogue, a narrative that considers and respects not just the needs of students and parents, but also the needs of the teachers themselves, and attempt to know as much as we possibly can know about the circumstances of teachers, and embrace this idea of matchmaking, of educational opportunity, of student need to teacher ability based on circumstance, we may actually avoid what could be a catastrophic condition in this country at a time when we are already experiencing a teacher shortage. So this is like the making of another crisis after the crisis. I don't think that will be the case in Miami-Dade, but I do believe it is a significant problem for the country as a whole.
Mm-hmm. And I would add that I think we've surveyed our college senate and got feedback that sort of aligns with the data that's coming out of USA Today. But it's interesting when you look below the surface of their survey results to see what's driving some of that. I think it's what's driving all of us right now, which is that every single day, it seems to be that what we know about this virus changes. So the uncertainty is just magnified. I'm sure everyone who's on this call also gets lots of emails every single day from friends and family, and in my case, from from employees and students who've read this article or read that blog or this blog. And there are just so many different and often conflicting sources of information about what we should be doing that I think is just creating a lot of noise that is very confusing and even frightening for individuals. And so we have been very clear at NOVA that we follow CDC guidance, we follow the Virginia Department of Health, we listen to the governor's Forward Virginia plan, and we look at those phases. We work with our local departments of health. These are the sources that we consult. I think just the proliferation of voices where everybody suddenly seems to be a public health or epidemiology expert and can write anything about anything just really has created a lot of noise for our students, our employees, our communities.
And Dr. Miller, I don't know if you have anything in particular to add to that, but I did want to ask you very, very quickly, because we're almost near the end of our time. So what your outlook is on the next coronavirus stimulus package? You mentioned a bit that, the House has passed a bill, the Senate is refusing to take that bill up at this time. But what have your conversations with lawmakers, lobbyists, others been like? Do you have a sense that state and local governments are going to get some funding in this next spending package? And do you have any sense either how much it might be coming or want to say how much you are requesting?
Yeah, my sense is, as we keep our conversations open and are listening to where the Senate is right now, we're looking to them to take up the next package, and we've seen some good movement on that. I do think there is a need to move swiftly, as we've discussed earlier. And we know that anytime one of the chambers puts out a bill that requires some negotiation, and so we understand that. But at the same time, there's such a vast need that we hope that will be taken up very soon.
Wonderful. Well, we're in the last 5 minutes, and so I wanted to just give you guys the opportunity to sort of make any closing remarks. I know there's obviously a lot here. We have plenty of questions, unfortunately, that we did not have the time to get to, but I wanted to see if you guys would sort of highlight, any thoughts any things that you're really thinking about and focused on right now, as well as anything, maybe one thing that you are expecting to change as a result of what schools have gone through in the last several months and are currently dealing with for the coronavirus. Does anyone want to start, or I can start calling on people like teachers used to do? I know this game.
Sure. So I'll start just to fill the silence. I think the takeaway for us has really been the equity implications of the virus, that it hasn't created them. What it has done is illuminate them. And I mentioned before that 2/3 of NOVA students are part-time. They worked to afford college. We're a community college. We are affordable. But those jobs have largely disappeared overnight. Today, yet another set of unemployment data was released, and the scale is almost unimaginable. And so what we are really looking to the future and what keeps me up at night is how do we serve the students from NOVA who need the most services from our institution, for whom our college was really that grounding, that foundation, that structure that kept things moving forward. How do we serve them going into the next academic year? And if there's one thing that we will probably change, it is also the notion that we need to become much more of a 24/7 institution, recognizing that the lives of our students and their own families are taking precedence at this moment, and we need to be available when our students need us most.
Ditto to everything that Anne just said. I would simply add that I will continue her statement. My biggest concern and what we've learned as a nation is that the gaps that already existed really manifested themselves in much more aggressive ways for certain groups of students, and that cannot be ignored. And if we allow the fiscal shock that we are about to experience to actually be punitive to those groups of students, then I don't think as a country we did our due diligence. Now, I am hopeful that state lawmakers, and we have a terrific relationship with our Commissioner of Education, our state legislators, local school districts, and the federal government actually will see a way to protect the fragile communities, to protect education, while at the same time to recognize the opportunity in the middle of this crisis. And I go back to what I said earlier, lift some of the regulations, change some of the policies, not just to deal with this crisis, but in anticipation of a better way of funding and supporting public education nationally.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add than what my colleagues have said. I guess I would just say that the opportunity that's been presented here, the escalation at which we changed was on a timeline that we've never seen. And so if we think about, what happened in 4 weeks from the time that, essentially the whole country shut down and we changed to a virtual learning environment for students, or in some cases, paper-based. We had to reckon with the things that were underlying in the equity issues that have been addressed and that have been there for a very long time. And they're so much more vivid to us. If we don't take this moment to recognize that, address those issues, and not assume that we're going to go back to another way. So this question, what we started with about when will school reopen, school is open. And we have to redefine the way in which we enter into that and how we address it for all kids.
I think that's a perfect note to close on. Thank you so much, Dr. Moffitt-Miller, Dr. Kress, Superintendent Carvello. Thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to everyone who followed along, watched, submitted questions. Thank you so much. I think this was a really, really insightful conversation. And definitely appreciate you guys weighing in on an issue that I know is on the mind of millions and millions of kids and millions of parents and teachers. So thank you all for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.